Perfect. Thanks, BITSS, so much for hosting us, for having me, and thanks to all of you for staying to the end of the Friday. It's been a lovely conference, learned so many things, and looking forward to the discussion at the end. So, as Alex said, I'm Sean Grant. I'm from Indiana University, and I'm presenting today briefly on a study looking at standards on open science practices of intervention evaluations among federal evidence clearinghouses. This is work done with Evan Mayo Wilson at IU Bloomington and Lauren Suplee, formerly of Child Trends, now at the William T. Grant Foundation. Quick intro for those of you who are not familiar, clearinghouses are repositories of evidence that follow published standards to identify empirical studies on the effects of interventions, assess the validity and rigor of those studies, and then disseminate information about which interventions are evidence-based. So they're a key part, particularly in the US, of evidence-based policy by distilling findings from trustworthy research to assist decision makers in selecting social programs for which there is rigorous causal evidence. And they're quite influential in the social intervention evidence ecosystem. So here's a list of prominent ones, all of which were part of our study. To have interventions recognized as evidence-based by these clearinghouses, investigators across the social sciences design studies to meet clearinghouse standards of evidence for evidence-based interventions. In other words, these standards influence investigator or researcher behavior because these clearinghouse ratings or designations are associated with increased funding, publication, visibility, credibility, and uptake of interventions, all of the things we talk about as currency in the current scientific academic ecosystem. In addition, a lot of journal editors, peer reviewers, and other research sponsors in these domains look to clearinghouses for guidance about what standards to use for publishing or sponsoring or funding in future research. Program developers market their interventions in press releases or on their websites using clearinghouse designations. So they might say, this is an intervention that is considered evidence-based by the What Works Clearinghouse. And then really increasingly, federal, state, and local governments in the US are mandating the use of evidence-based practices or interventions to inform decision-making. So as part of these initiatives, which sometimes are called tiered evidence funding or grant-making programs, the ratings of clearinghouses have the potential to influence literally the allocation of billions of dollars of government and public dollars appropriated by the federal government to social programs across policy sectors. So as such, one could think of these clearinghouses as the closest equivalent that social programs and social policy has to an FDA approval process. So these standards and processes should ensure that evidence-based interventions truly are beneficial, but growing concerns that I think motivate a lot of our attendants at BITSS about the transparency, openness, and reproducibility of published research give reasons to be cautious because clearinghouses rely pretty much entirely on published journal articles to rate interventions. So in our study, we examined the degree to which clearinghouses consider transparency, openness, and reproducibility of intervention evaluations. More details are in the preprint, which is linked here. But in summary, we looked at these 10 evidence clearinghouses listed on the slide that are associated with different divisions of education, health and human services, justice, and the Department of Labor. Of these 10 clearinghouses, we found that 7 consider at least one open science practice, while 3 do not consider any open science practices in their review process. No clearinghouses considered 5 of our open science practices of interest. So none of them look at registration of analysis plans, sharing data, sharing code, sharing materials, or standards related to citing data, code, and materials. 3 clearinghouses did consider adherence to standards for reporting research design and data analysis. This includes things like articulating author reporting guidelines, which the WWC, BSCR, and HomeV have done. 2 clearinghouses address prospective inclusion of studies in a structured web-based, publicly accessible registry. So HomeV reports trial registration numbers when they exist, and the Prevention Service Clearinghouses prioritizes including studies that have been registered, but it's not a requirement. Likewise, the Prevention Services Clearinghouse is the only study to address publicly sharing or publishing study protocols, and it prioritizes studies with protocols just as it does studies that are registered. 3 clearinghouses have standards related to the conflicts of interest of evaluators, reporting whether intervention developers are involved in the study and the funding source of each study, but again, these are not requirements to be included. And then lastly, 6 clearinghouses support the public availability of results and replication of intervention effects in multiple non-overlapping samples. So there are more details on what these standards are and what they look like in these clearinghouses, again, in the preprint. But in summary, while most clearinghouses encourage some open science, standards for designating interventions as evidence-based currently incorporate little, if any, information about open science, let alone requirements to be designated as evidence-based. So we provide some concrete recommendations for clearinghouses to adopt transparency in the paper. And to end on a positive note, I want to encourage everyone that change really is possible. So the Administration for Children and Families, who runs HomeV, TPP, a few of the other clearinghouses we have listed here, they're quite supportive of open science. So we provided our concrete suggestions in a response to a Federal Register notice that they posted on updating their standards and procedures for HomeV. And the table you see here is now officially part of their author guidelines, where they encourage investigators to report these open science practices as a starting point to hopefully in the future lead to some more robust requirements. So thank you to Arnold Ventures for funding this project and initiative. That's the website, and there are my details if anyone wants to get in touch.
Awesome, thanks, Shen. So we have, we're out of time for questions, but Sean will be here, so please post any questions that you might have in the chat and he'll get to them. So next up is Nick Otis, who is a PhD student here at UC Berkeley. You heard from him during the social science prediction panel yesterday, and he will give a lightning talk on that topic. Nick, take it away.
All right, so thanks for that introduction and for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to be talking about a project that looks at the ability of individuals to forecast the results of large field experiments. In this study, 135 academics who are either PhD holding economists or econ PhD students provide around 2,100 predictions of 50 experimental effects from 3 large randomized controlled trials. Now, I'm not going to have time to discuss the 3 predicted studies in detail, but broadly, these are large pre-registered randomized controlled trials. They all take place in Kenya. They're all well-powered with over 5,000 participants. And the topics broadly range from the general equilibrium effects of cash transfers in work by TED to work looking at the effects of mental health interventions and aspirational and goal-setting interventions. So why should we care about the accuracy of people's predictions? Well, this is going to sound familiar if you saw me present yesterday. A first motivation has to do with improving the design of experiments. If academics have accurate beliefs, maybe that can help us improve how we select treatments or which experimental conditions we run. Maybe it can help inform power calculations. Another motivation has to do with interpreting results from studies. Maybe forecasts can help us to understand exactly how much new information studies are providing. So now I'm going to quickly talk about 3 results from this study. The first result is that the mean prediction is quite accurate. So in this figure, we're looking at 50 experimental effects estimated for 14 different outcomes. On the x-axis, we have error measured in standard deviations. This vertical line means that the mean prediction, which is denoted by these points, is perfectly accurate. And so the first kind of result here is that the average absolute error is 0.1 standard deviations. So this is basically taking the average distance, absolute distance between these points and this red vertical line. The second kind of sub-result here has to do with a correlational measure of accuracy. So if you measure accuracy at the outcome level, looking at the correlation between the mean predictions and the experimental results, the average correlation across all 14 outcomes is 0.75. So those are 2 results relating to the accuracy of the mean prediction. Now let's compare that to the accuracy of individual predictions. And the kind of key result here, the takeaway, is that a lot of the accuracy that we observe from the mean prediction is coming from the fact that we're taking individual predictions here and we're averaging them together. So this figure depicts the negative absolute forecast error, again measured in standard deviations. This blue-green column is basically what we displayed on the last slide here, showing that the error, the average negative absolute error is 0.1 standard deviations. If you look at the individual forecasts, they're performing about 60% worse, 60% higher error here. And there's a similar result for correlational accuracy measures. Now, one kind of additional way to look at accuracy is to note that 75% of individuals are performing worse than the mean forecast. And it would be very helpful if we could identify which individuals are kind of performing better than the crowd. Are there either observable or unobservable correlates of forecast accuracy? So in this first panel, we look at a measure of expertise, which is academic rank among the forecasters. Here, again, we're using the accuracy measure of negative absolute error, and we're comparing a variety of groups to assistant professors. PhD students do about as well. Postdocs are doing a tiny bit worse. Associate professors, a tiny bit worse than them. And full professors are doing worst of all. Now, this isn't particularly well powered. We can't read too much into this, but we can reject that more senior academics are performing substantially better than assistant professors at predicting results from these experiments. Finally, let's look at a measure of confidence. So maybe people have private information on the accuracy of their predictions. Here we ask people to provide an estimate of how many of their forecasts will fall within these 10% bounds around the experimental effect. Individuals predict that approximately 40% of their predictions will fall within these 10% bounds. In reality, it's only 3% of their predictions that are falling within these 10% bounds around the experimental effect. Those are my 3 results. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for a very efficient and very informative presentation, Nick. Do we have any quick questions for Nick, or very quick reactions? Okay, maybe you can post the questions in the chat. I think we're gonna have to move with the next presentation, which is by Tara Slow, who is a PhD candidate in political science at Columbia University. Tara, I can see your slides. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So I want to talk about experiments on real elections, which is a tool that's been around in the social sciences since at least the 1920s, but has proliferated rapidly in the last 20 years. And I think 2 aspects of this proliferation sort of motivated this investigation. First, we're working often at unprecedented scale. We can think about this as the number of possibly treated voters, right? And secondly, we're also intervening in really different electoral contexts. These experiments generally started where researchers were living, and now we're doing these all over the world. And so one of the most common pieces of ethical guidance for these experiments, which is not new here, is do not change aggregate election results, i.e. do not change who wins. And so what this paper does is, I'm going to sort of take that normative stance of given here for the purposes of the presentation and think about sort of how we could sort of achieve this goal through research design on these experiments, and then thinking about what the implications are for where and when we should be using experiments on real elections. And so what the paper does is it sort of presents a formal characterization of experiments on elections. And what I do is I derive this quantity, which I'm calling the maximum aggregate electoral impact in each district, which is sort of an upper bound on how much we could move vote share using given an experimental design. And so there's sort of 3 aspects that we need to know for this. First, we need a mapping between the experimental units like clusters and electoral districts. When we're not treating at the district level, this is at least not frequently given in papers. And so it's a little bit hard to map between the 2 things in the existing literature. Second, how do voters respond to the intervention? And here we're going to sort of give voters maximum agency to respond in any sort of possible way, any direction, by invoking Mansky or extreme value balance to bound plausible voter responses to the treatment. And then the third component is which voters may be impacted by the intervention. And so there's 2 aspects to this. First, we need to think about what the experimental allocation of treatment is versus the counterfactual allocation. So the counterfactual would be what would happen if we weren't doing the experiment. We could think of some experiments where nothing happens, there's no intervention without the sort of research, the experiment, and others where we're working with partners in which the intervention would still happen, but would probably treat different voters. And here we're going to think about voters as being treated because of the experiment or untreated because of the experiment, right? And because of the aggregation of votes, it's not sort of just immediately we need to be able to think about what this is doing sort of with reference to the district. Third, finally, we also need to think about interference between voters, right? So some form of spillovers. And so what I do here is I estimate this quantity or calculate this quantity under 3 different assumptions about interference. First, we have, so we can think about SUTVA, we can think about a stronger version of SUTVA and also a weaker version of SUTVA, okay? So once we have this quantity, then sort of I propose a decision rule, and I think that there's sort of room for different decision rules in different contexts, but here's sort of one as a start. And so what I do is I compare this maximum aggregate electoral impact to what the anticipated margin of vitality, which would be sort of the minimum change in vote share at which we would get a different office holder coming out of the election, right? But there's a big challenge here that we don't know this parameter ex ante, right? And when we're designing the experiment, but we can try to predict it. So what I'm going to call is sort of this bound. So if we think about what the predictive distribution using sort of whatever predictive algorithm, think about, for example, the 5th percentile of that distribution. And so we can then think about this as the suggested decision rule. And so basically the idea is an experiment is sufficiently unlikely to change an outcome if this maximum aggregate electoral effect is less than this bound. And so this gives our decision rule. And so we can sort of take this and think about what are the implications for the design and use of electoral experiments. And so if we take this decision rule, there are sort of 5 design recommendations that come from this. So first, we can try to reduce the left-hand side here. And so to reduce this aggregate electoral impact, we can reduce the number of voters assigned to treatment, which is pretty obvious. But less obvious is that we can potentially reallocate experimental saturation across districts to sort of comply with this inequality. Second, all else equal, we should perhaps be thinking about experimenting in larger electoral districts. I think an impetus to sort of work in low turnout or low information environment sort of pushes us in the opposite direction of sort of what this guidance would suggest. And third, we should think about what interventions we're actually randomizing. And interventions in this case should be selected to improve the plausibility of assumptions of some restrictions on interference, both for identification and for these ethical concerns. Secondly, we can also try to ensure that the right-hand side is large enough. And so this implies avoiding experimentation in really close or unpredictable races. I think globally, there's a huge disparities in the amount of money and data devoted to predicting elections. And so some places are sort of just, we don't actually have good predictions. And that makes this sort of particularly, this type of experimentation particularly difficult under this decision rule. Second, we should think about what electoral systems we're working in. So, I mean, one thing is we can sort of theoretically give the upper bound of this of psi d as the reciprocal of district magnitude. And this suggests that we should really be focusing, to the extent that we're experimenting in these elections, in some types of electoral systems, i.e. first past the post, as opposed to, say, proportional representation races. And so I think from these, you can think about some trade-offs between these strategies and sort of different measures of learning from experiments. And I think this is something that should go into the design of experiments in ways to sort of think about how we can take most seriously sort of our ethical responsibilities as researchers. So thank you so much.